E benvenuti. Come sapete la conferenza questa sera sarà in inglese, quindi adesso passo subito in un idioma che sia comprensibile anche al nostro ospite. So, good evening and welcome. I'm very glad to start again this season of dialogue with the most important directors, or I would say the most important directors and presidents in this case of major European institutions. This is within a framework that we launched last year under the name What is a Museum? As you probably all of you know, we will celebrate next year the bicentennial of the Museo Egizio, the most ancient Egyptian museum in the world, and in order to prepare that we thought we were not strong enough. We need the advice of scholars and intellectuals who around the world are dealing with museums to understand what museums are nowadays. Well, I'm very honored tonight to have Professor Parzinger with us. I was looking through his CV, but it's almost impossible to summarize what he is and what he has done, because we would need a lecture to summarize what he has done. But let me say that since 2008, he's the president of the Stiftung Preußisches Kulturbesitz. So he's the president of the foundation of the Prussian cultural heritage, which is managing the most important museums in Berlin. He's an archaeologist himself. He has been president of the German Archaeological Institute. He has been excavating in Siberia, in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, and in Iran. So it's also nice that an archaeologist, somebody who has been working in the field, somebody who has been running the Archaeological Institute, is now the president of one of the major cultural institutions who is dealing with a lot of themes that are very dear to our heart as well. What you do about provenance, what you do with contested collection, what you do to be more inclusive, how can you create a cultural discourse, how can you have a relation between material culture and immateriality, how can you be in touch with new generation, and how can we transfer the memory of the past for the coming generations. So we will structure our dialogue as following tonight. Professor Parzinger will give us a lecture of about 45 minutes explaining how the Berlin cultural landscape has been changing the last few years, and then we will have the chance, I will be the honor to start asking him some questions, and then Professor Parzinger is of course also open for questions that might come from the public. So for me, I would like to thank you again for being here. It's a great honor for us, for our institution to have you here, and we are particularly lucky tonight because also Professor Dr. Seifried is present as well. So we also have the director of the Neues Museum with us. So Professor Parzinger, the word is yours.
Yeah, dear Christian, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. I never was in Torino, I had to admit, so it was a unique chance, and when you asked me to come, of course, I immediately said yes. Because I know that Torino, the Museo Egizio, is one of the most important, if not the most important Egyptian museum worldwide outside Egypt, and therefore it's also a special honor for me to be here. Well, the Prussian Cultural Heritage Organization, I always say, to explain it shortly, is something like the German Smithsonian, because it includes not only the 19 national museums of Berlin, from archaeology to contemporary art, it's also the National Library of Berlin with 12 million of volumes, the largest scientific library in Germany, then the Geheime Staatsarchiv, the Secret State Archive of Prussia, 37 kilometers of documents of Prussian and early German history, the Ibero-American Institute and the State Institute for Music Research. So different kinds of heritage under one roof. This is the special thing. And as all these institutions have been founded in a time before the Second World War, when the state of Prussia was still existing, and Prussia founded this organization. Therefore, after the war, when they came under this roof, it was called Prussian Cultural Heritage. Many people misunderstand it. They say, well, what have you to do with the Hohenzollern? I say, nothing. We have world heritage, heritage of all continents, of all periods, in all these different institutions. We have about 2,000 employees, and therefore we are by far the largest cultural institution in Germany. And of course, we also are helping to change the architectural landscape of Berlin, the German capital. You see here the area around the Reichstag. This is the political center, and the, let's say, spiritual or historical center is here, Museum Alla and the Humboldt Forum. This is one of our core areas. It's not the only one, but the one most will talk today in Berlin. Of course, the origin of the museums in Berlin was in the palace of the Prussian kings. This palace, I mean, you will have a lecture I saw in the program by Hartmut Dorgalow, the artistic director of the Humboldt Forum. I think it's one of the last lectures. Nevertheless, I also have to talk on the Humboldt Forum because it's closely connected to the museums. All the collections have been in the old palace, which has been blasted and destroyed by the communist government in GDR after the Second World War. Here are some of the pictures, how it has been. And from the palace, from the Berlin Palace, step by step, the collections moved to the Museum Alla. So the idea to put opposite to the palace in the historical center of the city, to plan a landscape of different museums started in the palace. And the decisive historical fact was that when Napoleon conquered Berlin, occupied Berlin, he took with him, it was rather normal that in the occupied cities, he took the art collections to Paris. The art collections have not been accessible. They have been in the palace only, but not accessible to the public, of course. The public was not aware that there are these collections, huge collections. But when they came back after the defeat of Napoleon, for the first time, they have been shown to the public. For the first time, as we say, Berliners have been queuing to see an exhibition. And from that time on, they had to be found at a museum. And even after the Napoleonic Wars, Prussia, of course, was in a very bad economic situation. The country was destroyed, many problems. But nevertheless, they invested money to get the best architect in Germany at that time, Schinkel, to build the so-called Old Museum, the first public museum in Prussia. And then step by step followed many other museums. The decisive man for the concept, the architect of this old museum, the first museum in Prussia, was Schinkel. But the intellectual architect was Wilhelm von Humboldt. He developed the idea how the first part of the collections from the palace should move and how to present them in this museum. A few decades later, when Friedrich Wilhelm IV, in the middle of the 19th century, was king of Prussia, he was very dedicated to arts and science, and he said, one museum is not enough. Behind this museum, in the rest of this peninsula, in this island, we will build more museums. We will fill the island with museums and step by step move all the collections from the palace to these museums. This is a sketch made by him, by the way, the idea he had. And then the second museum was the so-called New Museum. This was a completely different concept than the old museum. This was already the first, one could say, also it was a little bit tiny, universal museum. There was, of course, Egypt. There was Central European prehistory. There was the graphic collection and many other things, so different collection. The ethnographic collection also had two galleries in this building, so several collections, and the visitors could walk around and really see different cultures. And then, of course, there have been other museums built, the Pergamon, and so on and so on. But then, even before the First World War, this museum island was not enough. In this phase, in the beginning of the 20th century, it was really a phase of expansion of science, but also of art and of culture. And they started the plan to build in the fringes, what is today Dahlem, other museums. Because in the center, in the historical center of the city, there was not enough space. And what is so interesting, they said, we have an old master painting gallery, but this is only showing European Western art. At that time, they said European art. And we need also a museum to show, not in the ethnographical sense, but Asian art, for African art, for Oceanic art, and for art from the Americas. And there was a plan to build in this, but the research institutes have been built up. It was called a little bit, it's on the fringes of Berlin, the Prussian Oxford, this was called, this part of Berlin that started building before the First World War. This was the only one which was finished for Asia, but 4 such museums for these 4 continents should be built, and to put it on an equal level, art from Africa, from the Americas to European or Asian. I think at that time, beginning of 20th century, this was already very, very modern. Of course, then First World War, the 20s, financial crisis, the rest of the story, 30s, Second World War, destruction, divided Berlin. And then when Berlin was divided, they continued, but not the old concept. Sorry. They did not continue the old concept from the beginning of the 20th century, but they said, well, all the collections which we have in West Berlin, we built new buildings, which you see below, I will not use this, for the other collections. So there was the West Berlin Universal Museum. But then, when the German unification came in 1990, the whole situation changed. The collections moved again to the center, and of course the Museum Island, this is rendering a picture how it will be then maybe in the late 30s, early 40s, when everything will be finished, how it will look like. Because the museums on the Museum Island, they have been, except one, they have been rebuilt after the Second World War by GDR, but not really, they did some repair, let's say. And at the moment of the German unification, the buildings had been in very bad state. So we really have this, the master plan Museum Island, step by step, profound refurbishment of all these museums, and by the way, not only refurbishment, but also adapting them to the needs of museums of the 21st century. This is a talk which is ongoing since the late 90s, and still will keep us busy for 15, 20 years or something like that. It started with the renovation of the old National Gallery, art of 19th century, finished in 2001. Then the Bode Museum, Sculpture Museum, finished in 2006. And then you see, when there was the moment of the German unification, the old museum, the second museum on the island, was still a ruin on the Museum Island. When I visited East Berlin in the 80s, I was wondering, I was in the Pergamon, I went out, I stood at the canal here and was looking at the ruins of the new museum, and I said, I couldn't understand why they didn't repair it, why they didn't build it up. But this was maybe the most complicated project we had, and I think it's one of the best projects with the architect David Chipperfield really did. We got in the meantime almost all national, international awards for architecture, for restoration, for heritage, because he had the concept not to rebuild it as it has been before. So what is original, he kept as it was. He didn't repair the paintings and so on. And what he added in a way to give rebirth to the building was clearly separated from the old structures. And this is really a marvelous, it's a masterpiece. It's much more lovely and beautiful and intellectually also much more attractive than the old museum has been when you look at the pictures. They are black and white, but if you imagine them in color, it's a little bit kitschy. So this is really a masterpiece, this museum. And then the only museum which we added to the Museum Island, which is UNESCO World Heritage Site, is the James Simon Gallery, also built by David Chipperfield. We needed a new entrance building because in all these historical buildings we have a small corner for a small bookshop, perhaps cafes where there are 5 or 6 tables, and for millions of visitors, you can imagine this is not possible. So we need infrastructure, but we also need other kind of infrastructure. Not only there's a restaurant now, there's a huge bookshop, but in the ground floor, there's also a space for temporary exhibitions. We have no space for temporary exhibitions in the museum, Alan. If you want to bring an exhibition, we had to empty the galleries with our collections. And this, of course, is not very funny and not very good for the collections. And there's also a lecture hall below these stairs. So important functions which we needed. And this was finished in 2019, so a few years ago, and it's also fantastic. It's a modern architecture, but it's fantastically finding its place among these historical buildings. You can't see here now, but there are from the late 19th century, a colonnade, and Chipperfield took up this motif or colonnade, but in a modern, contemporary, artistic speech. Then also these stairs, you can see it, here's the old museum, it has also huge stairs, so it's repeating this architectural element from the old from Schinkel's old museum, and of course here there's a direct connection with the Pergamon Museum. And also this is the entrance building. Here you go into the Pergamon Museum, we will see immediately, and in the floor level you have also an underground connection to the new museum. So it's connecting the museums, because this is important, because the museums are in a way standing back to back, because the Pergamon Museum has the entrance to the west, the new museum to the east, the Schinkel's old museum to the south, and the Bode Museum to the north. Before the war, there have been bridges in between the museums, so people could walk from one museum to the other, but they have been destroyed in the Second World War. They have not been built up, so we needed another idea, and this was the archaeological promenade, an underground connection. I will show a picture also later. But the basic difference of the Universal Museum of Berlin with London, the British, the Louvre, the Hermitage, and the Metropolitan is, this is one huge building with different wings, floors, and showing all art from any period, any part of the world. But here, from the beginning, it was different. It wasn't one huge building, but they built 5 buildings. And these 5 buildings in the course of 100 years. So you start with Schinkel and you end up with Messel. So different architects with different concepts how a museum should be built, and also different concept of how presenting the objects, how telling the narratives in the museum. This was one of the reasons for UNESCO to, in the year 1999, to make it World Heritage, not only because the outstanding collections, outstanding architecture, but also it's a journey through the history of museology, if you want, and a history through museological buildings, museological architecture. And this is really something very special on the Museum Island. And where we are working now since 10 years, exactly 10 years, is the Pergamon Museum. The Pergamon Museum is a huge project. I mean, we are repairing now this. There are deep changes, especially in the north wing, and now late October we will close the whole building because we have to start the refurbishment here in the south wing, where is Mesopotamia, the Ishtar Gate, and so on. And then for 3 years, 3.5 years, the whole building will be closed, but then this part will be open, and then we continue until 2037, when the whole building will be finished. You can imagine it's really, really complicated. This building, one should never have built in this way on this place, because this is Venice. All these buildings are standing on hundreds, thousands of oak beams, because there is sand below, there is no rock. The rock is 20, 30, 35 meters deep, so it makes it very complicated. And this building is much too heavy, but of course, what to do? Now we have to deal with it, and it's really, really giving us a lot of trouble. Therefore, it also needs so much time. And the Pergamon Museum was the first, or one of the first, worldwide first museums of architecture, architectural museum. The basic idea was this, the Ishtar Gate, the Pergamon altar, the Mshatta facade from Jordan, this Umayyad desert castle, to present architecture in a way that people get a feeling how it has been in nature. They could approach, there was space, they could approach. The ceilings is glass, so the daylight came in. The idea was really to give them a feeling. Of course, it could not be, the Pergamon altar was not standing in that way, but at least to give them an idea what ancient architecture is. And this is how it will be in. And you see, there will be the fourth wing where we enter now, Old Egypt, the Kalabsha Gate, the Sahara Temple, and others. So this fourth wing, which will connecting the two ends of the wings, this will be new. Then we have to break through here in the south wing, which is dedicated to Mesopotamia. Here see the sculptures from Tel Halaf. They will be presented here. Then you enter the south wing with Mesopotamia. Here Sinjali and others, these Neo-Hittite places, the first German excavations in the Near East, in Anatolia. And then the Ishtar Gate, the procession street approaching the Ishtar Gate. To the left, there are other galleries which Assur, with reconstructions of the palaces of Assur, Assyrian palaces. And then, of course, you come to the Ishtar Gate. And by the way, it has not been like this. So, because many people think the Germans took the Ishtar Gate as you saw it and brought it to Berlin. No, 35,000 of small fragments. And most of the nice bluish tiles are copies, are modern copies. Here you see the Greek-Roman world, and then we enter the holiest place of the Museum Island, the Pergamon altar. And then we move to the northern wing. There comes now the Hellenistic gallery. And then when we go to the left, and you see, it was original. It was painted. The walls have been painted in this light yellow, light bluish. It was not after reconstruction in GDR. It was brownish, but it is a completely different impact when you see it in this light bluish painting. And now the north wing is inside completely changed. Only the outer walls are standing, and this will then present for the first time the full length of the Mshatta facade, this Umayyad desert castle from Jordan. So the basic idea is really to walk through the history of architecture of antiquity, starting with ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Assur, Babylon, then the Greek-Roman world, and then ending up, and this was the new asset which we will receive through the refurbishment and restoration, ending up with Islam, the Islamic period. And also making people understand that the Greek-Roman world, of course, has its connections to the ancient Near East, to old pharaonic Egypt and Mesopotamia, and also that the early Islam cannot be understood without taking into account antiquity, late antiquity especially. So these connections, I think, have to become very clear, and this is the idea. I talked already about this archaeological promenade, the underground connection of this 4 of the 5 museums, and we did it already. In the new museum, the inner courtyards is a little bit like what you are planning here at the Egyptian Museum. The inner courtyards are one level lower, and then they get an underground connection. So it's not only tunnels which are connecting the museums, they are really, we always say it's our 6th museum, because there are underground galleries. And as these buildings on the Museum Island, they are dedicated to certain cultures, to certain periods of human development. So we will have interdisciplinary exhibitions in this long museum, in this long 6th museum of the Museum Island. But of course, this will only be finished when all the refurbishment of all the museums is done. Then, of course, this only by the way, opposite to it, we have here the Archaeological Center. We already, several years ago, almost 10 years ago, we took out all the scientific facilities from the museums and concentrated them here. Library, labs, certain collections, papyrus collection, and many others. Cuneiform tablets, all this is gathered here, and of course this is an excellent space also for scientists, scholars who are coming from all over the world and want to work with and on our collections. This can be done here. So research facilities, and of course what is important for us is also the history. The history of the collections is multifaceted. But of course, you know, after the Second World War, when Germany was occupied, the Soviet army took almost everything. It goes so quickly. Sorry. They took almost everything. Here you see that the Pergamon altar was transported to Petersburg. It was in Leningrad in the Hermitage, and it returned in the 50s. And then other things which never returned, we thought they are completely lost. It turned out in the 90s that they are, of course, not lost, but they are still in Russian museums. Here the famous, of course, the Troy treasures, or the treasure from Eberswalde, one of the most important Bronze Age finds, golden Bronze Age finds from a place north of Berlin. And what could we do? I mean, the Russians said, well, Germans destroyed our country. We had to say, when the war ended, they took 2.5 million of objects and brought them to the Soviet Union. In the 50s, they gave back 1.5 million to GDR. So 1 million of objects is still missing. But of course, from the legal point of view, it's ours. But on the other hand, they have a different view on that. And we also have to say, we destroyed this country completely, also culturally. And it's difficult to say you have to give it back immediately. I mean, so we say, let's go forward. Let's making about this difficult issue something which is uniting us. And for many, many years, for decades, and therefore you can imagine that the political situation since last year, February of last year for us, was really very, very disappointing. We had long-lasting, for more than 20 years, close cooperations with the Hermit. I'm always sorry. With the Hermitage, with the Historic Museum in Moscow, the Pushkin Museum. We did common exhibitions with so-called trophy art. And we say, okay, some of the collections are in Berlin, others are in several Russian museums. They are split. The documentation is split, the complexes are split, objects from one and the same grave are split up between Germany and Russia. What to do? We can't change it, we archaeologists or scientists. So we work together. And for many, many years, all my colleagues had complete free access to the depots of these museums. There was no secret, so we could really work well together and did an enormous good chance here. This was in 2013, by the way, 10 years ago, with Putin and Merkel, here Piotrowski opening the Bronze Age exhibition, which a lot of trophy art. This was really a way, and we both said, the Russians and me, we said, well, thanks to this trophy art problem, we can't without each other. They cannot without us, and we cannot without them. So if something which in the basic point is negative, we really achieve to make something positive out of that. And therefore, now it's again a turning point, and we of course, nobody knows how we can continue. This is one point, just to explain you that all these collections have many political or cultural political issues connected with them. But of course, what Museum of the Future, education is something which is extremely important, to be inclusive, I mean, to all kind of ages. And we got, this was a donation, this wonderful building just opposite the Museum Island, also built by David Chipperfield, was a donation to the foundation and now dedicated for education. It's our educational center, really an outstanding building, all age groups. And also, you always have to see how can you interest especially young people. Therefore, I'm happy to see many young people here in the audience. How can you interest them, especially school pupils, to go into the museum? The Bode Museum, for example, is very complicated. It's fantastic, but it's basically a museum of sculptures, medieval and later sculptures from medieval times to 18th century. Of course, this is not an art which is so immediately accessible to the youth and to young people. So we had a program there with artists, and not to talk, this is saying the Holy, I don't know, or St. George or whatever, but really to ask these young people, what kind of emotions are they feeling when they look at the works of art? And this produced a completely new approach, and at the very end, especially with school classes from Neukölln and Kreuzberg, which have 70% Turkish people of Turkish or Arabic origin, and they really felt that this museum is also their museum. I think this is very important to be inclusive also, because in Berlin it's a very different multicultural, multi-ethnical, multi-religious population already, and a museum has to confront that, has to offer possibilities also for these people, and not only for the classical German European audience. Another issue, we have collection from the Near East. The Near Eastern Museum, the Museum of Islamic Art, of course, what we could do during this terrible destructions in the Syrian civil war, we did a documentation. The Syrian Heritage Archive project for many, many years, we and my colleagues gathered from our institution, from others, all historic photos, plans, diaries from excavations, any kind of information about these sites, and digitizing them, and they are freely accessible. So when the moment comes, I don't know what is happening now there, when the moment comes to restore this building, to decide what can be restored and how should it be restored, to have already all the documentation prepared for this kind of work. I think this is what we can do now, or in these years of the war. Nobody could go there, but this could be done, and with many international partners. I think this is also an obligation which museums have, not only the responsibility for their collections, but also for the countries where the collections come from, and when these countries undergo or go through a very, very difficult period, really to try to help as much as we can. And I mean, this is another example, just to make you a favor. I think this is also important, that European museums, Egyptian museums, are working together to support Egyptian museums and their planning. But not because we are in a neo-colonialistic way just telling them how to do it, because they ask us. And this is really cooperation on eye-to-eye level. And I think this is also an excellent example what we can do for the countries. And we have an obligation to the countries, towards the countries where our collections are coming from. But that now, leaving the Museum Island and moving to this project, well, you will have a lecture in this series of lectures later in this year, but nevertheless, I cannot exclude that, but because the Museum Island is everything. The Museum Island, the great vision of the 19th century was the cultural and artistic development of Europe and its roots in the Near East, from the beginnings until the 19th century. Now we live in a globalized world, and I think it was a good decision if the parliament decided to reconstruct the destroyed Berlin Palace, to use it for collections, and to expand the Museum Island to presenting their collections from Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas, and making the Museum Island complete as a place really of world cultures. And well, this is a photo from the old museum, the first museum, looking towards the palace. Here you see, this was a photo montage in the first years of planning this project. The interesting idea is, I explained at the beginning that the collections moved. They all have been originally, of course not so huge collection as later, but the beginning of all the collection was in Berlin Palace. And even Friedrich Wilhelm IV and his architect Stüler thought already, when this first museum was by Schinkel was built, they had the idea, as I mentioned, moving all the collection to the Museum Island with different buildings, and also connecting the palace and the museums by constructions. This was never realized, because the palace was almost not used as a palace. The kings and later the German emperors, they hated this building because it was in the middle of the city. All the people, the plebs was around. They have been sitting in Potsdam and wherever, a little remote to the population. So this was just used for receptions and other for dancing when there was something special, but not really as a residence for the Prussian kings or German emperors. So it was always a palace, but always rather difficult, rather special kind of palace. And well, you know the story. It was during the war. At the end of the war, it was destroyed, but not too heavily. In 1946, they used part of the palace which was not destroyed for exhibitions of the National Gallery. But then there was a decision in the year 50-51 to blast it and remove it completely. And 20 years later, the Palace of the Republic was built, and then the Palace of the Republic was then removed demolished, and this was a decision by the parliament already more than 20 years ago to reconstruct the palace but not as a palace, as a museum or cultural complex named after the Humboldt brothers. Alexander von Humboldt, it's clear its relation to, he was the scientific discoverer of Latin America, but also Wilhelm von Humboldt, he was dealing with South Asian languages, with languages from the Pacific region, so both had this cosmopolitan approach to world cultures. All cultures are equal. This was already in the beginning of the 19th century, from this Enlightenment thinking. Also, it was a period of colonialism and so on, slavery and so on, but they had really a very cosmopolitan idea how the world should be. And of course, there have been excavations from the destroyed palace. Also interesting because this was a part where the oldest from the 15th century, the oldest remains of Berlin have been, must have been, they have not been excavated when the Palace of the Republic in the GDR period was built. And then the reconstruction of the palace, also a huge ancient gallery, but what I want to refer to, yes, we also, the parts, some parts of the building which are still the cellars, which are accessible. This is the only parts which are original. They should be accessible to the people. If there are a few remains which are original, they should at least be accessible, but the rest is reconstructed. Not 100%, it's more a quote than a real reconstruction, but what is important, what I want to show then, the exhibitions. There's one of the City Museum of Berlin, but then the collections of the Ethnological Museum in Dahlem and the Museum of Asian Art. And both museums, it's like the Quai Branly, to talk in Paris, comparing to the Paris situation, the Musée du Quai Branly and the Musée Guimet, both go into one building. And of course, the collections come from many scientific collections. Foster, a German scholar who traveled with James Cook, and he brought the first pieces for our Pacific collection. Alexander von Humboldt brought objects and many others. So it's also reflecting the story of scientific research and investigating the world. Of course, a huge Pacific collection which we had. Many of these are from, of course, Germany was a late and not very years including colonial power, but Germany had the largest colonial empire in the Pacific region, so much bigger than what the French or even the British had, if you exclude Australia, of course. And of course, many objects come from these collections, and of course, we have to present of course, we want to tell the stories of these objects, but nevertheless, we also have to show the colonial context, because many people think that colonialism in Africa was cruel. Namibia, the German genocide to Herero and Nama, and in the Pacific it was just a paradise, because the expressionists, they took their inspirations. This was not the case. It was also cruel, and I think this is not the only story which should be told, but it's also a story which has to be told in these galleries. Interesting, when we built up these gathering buildings from Palau, we had a group of artists from Palau, and they did it for us. And they've been very happy in doing it. There's no illegal context, it's clear, it has been bought. But even now, when presenting them, building them up in a new way, really including the knowledge which the specialists from these parts of the world have. Or the famous story of the Benin bronzes. Maybe you read about that. We had in Berlin the largest collection of Benin bronzes after the British Museum, more than 500. In the whole of Germany, more than 1,000. And of course, it was connected, a clear context of looting, not by Germans, by the British, but nevertheless, then it was sold, we bought it. It was clear, a political decision, but also supported by all the museums which had collections. It should be restituted. And that was one of the three persons who were responsible with the negotiations. And for me, it was so impressive because from the beginning, when we talked, they said, okay, we want to have these things back, they have been stolen, they should not be in Berlin because they have been looted. But then at the same moment they said, but okay, of course we want that this art continues being seen in Berlin, in London, wherever in the world. We do not want that everything comes back. We want that it is acknowledged what happened by the Europeans. It's acknowledged that this is looted. It's acknowledged also through restitutions. But we have no interest in getting all the objects back. It's the contrary. We want that this, and I mean, Benin art is extraordinary art. They want to have it visible in all of the world, in all museums of the world where they are. And this kind of cooperations, and for example, the education program of these 3 Benin Gallery in the Humboldt Forum has been worked out by 2 young guys from Benin City. This is also a way of cooperation, a way of finding solutions. Not only, things happen, what happened in history happened, but we have to try, and we cannot only say, well, we give everything back, we are very bad. There's no solution. And what happened also for certain reasons. But and there's not only black and white in history. History is full of gray tones, and we have to accept that, and everybody's accepting that. And the Africans accept it much more than many of the activists here in Europe, which think that they have to speak for the Africans. But nevertheless, really to work oriented towards the future. And we had another piece, and there was one of the sultans from Cameroon who came to us, the son of one of the former sultans, said there was a very famous throne. And of course, when he came with a large crowd of people coming with him, they said, well, will he sit on the throne or not? Because he was not in a vitrine, he was standing free. And the curators, if you will sit on the throne. And he stepped up and sat down for a moment, and he stepped down from the throne. And he said, sorry, I know I should not have done that, but my grandfather was sitting on that, my father was sitting on that, so I also had to sit for a moment. And then the journalists have been awaiting. Okay, now he will say, it has to go back. No, he said, but we should not look back what happened. We should look to the future. And this, I think, is a way where we really can, in this kind of cooperations, do a lot together and find a completely new relation to the global south, which is important for Europe, also in a political sense. I mean, we all know what China, Russia is doing there, and we have a responsibility. We have a very, compared to Russia and China, a difficult, complicated history with Africa. But there is also from the other side an enormous openness to do something together, future-oriented. And Namibia. We had a group from Namibians working on our collections, and at the very end, it was before the pandemic, they said, well, the lady director from the museum in Windhoek said, we have 7,000 objects in Windhoek. We do not want to get back things which are just doubling what we have, what we already have. But we want 23 objects, and we have 11,000, 23. Maybe later they will want some others, but 23. And this we want to get back because 3 of the 23 have a genocidal context, so no question, we give it back. But the other 20 are from before it became German colony, from the 1860s, 1870s, collected by missionaries, by merchants, and small Muppets of children, parts of dresses, because this object has been so important because it is documenting the change of the indigenous costume to a more and more European influence costume. And I said, we do not have anything from this period. These decades are completely missing in our collection. Please, this we want to have back because then you give us back history. And okay, we gave it back. And with these objects now in Otjiwarongo, north of Windhoek, they founded a Namibian fashion museum. These objects are presented there, and now designers, fashion makers are really working and taking inspiration from these objects. And this is also an example how one always can find solutions which are future-oriented. Or with Angola, it's not only German colonies. I mean, the Germans in the 19th, early 20th century, they collected like hell from all parts of the world and also from Angola. But even there, we have cooperations with the people, with the communities. This is very important. And even Oceania, for example, Amazonia, for example, we have now for almost 10 years indigenous groups from Brazil, from Colombia, and from Venezuela are coming to Berlin working with the objects. There's no question of restitution. Why? It was not taken illegally. And they say, no, it's fine, this is not our problem. But we want that we want to tell our stories in your museum. This is what they want. And I mean, this round, this roundish presentation, their idea, their scheme of the world is a roundel. So this, and many, I do not want to go into details because I'm talking too long, but so many interesting ideas are coming from them, and together with our curators are integrated in the narrative of the collections. And, or here, for example, Omaha, the collection of La Flèche. He was Omaha from Nebraska, but he was also ethnographer. And the first director of the Ethnographical Museum, Adolf Bastian, at the very end of the 19th century, asked him, collect 60 objects which you think best represent your culture. And I buy it. And he collected that and he sold it to the museum. And then they always have been in the depot, never has been shown. And now, of course, together with groups from Nebraska, with Omaha, we prepared that. And of course, the Omaha people have been completely flashed because they said, there are so many objects, we don't have them in any other museums. So, and then again, cooperation, working together, and then developing new stories, new narratives, and telling them in the museum, I think is so important. Of course, then the Museum of Asian Art, the Turfan collections from the Silk Road, these Buddhist caves, cave paintings represented here. Also, for example, in Angkor Wat, I know not hundreds, but about around 50 meters of reliefs, there are copies. And of course, with the copies, the reliefs in the original, some are destroyed, others are by pollution not in a very good situation anymore. But here, with these copies made in the late 19th century, of course, it documents a phase of conservation which is different to the state of conservation today, of preservation today. And this, of course, we also present here. And I think it's, together with a model, it's a nice idea, and it's not always necessary to have the originals. And then something Chinese Imperial Art, and what our designers proposed us never convinced us. And then at the very end, we have been so desperate that one of my colleagues came with the fantastic idea to ask Wang Shu, Pritzker Prize winner, very important architect and designer from China, and we asked him, and he designed with natural material, with wood, with clay, with stone, not only the materiality, but also the setting of this presentation of imperial art from China is really very, very impressive. Of course, you cannot see in the picture. You have to go there. It's really impressive. And this is another way of cooperation, that they not only develop the narratives together with us, they also develop the design, the presentation of the galleries. And of course, this is then the expansion of the 21st century of the museum island, Europe and the Near East, and now the rest of the world. And also what we now slightly start on the museum in the Humboldt Forum, but which has to be expanded, is comparing cultures. I mean, Renaissance and Benin bronze. When the first Benin bronze in the beginning of the 20th century came to Berlin, the art historians really have been flashed. They thought this is a quality which you compare to Renaissance art. Or, for example, we have, of course, Greek art, but then Gandhara art, influenced by the Greeks, of course, later, but this Greek influence, you can really, how cultures influence each other, this still we have to develop. We have it in a few galleries in the Humboldt Forum, but the potential of all this collection is huge, really, to bring this forward, to make culture speak to each other and to understand how man behaved, how man developed, how man acted in different situations. And I think this is the great, the unique chance which we have here. But of course, now everything is opened, the Humboldt Forum is open. As I said, you still will have a lecture on that, but you always have the feeling that work is just starting. Thank you very much. I think anyway I spoke.
Well, I don't even know where to start thanking you for, well, you have seen that Berlin is the place to be. We can really say that it's the cultural capital of Europe. I've been saying for many years, and what is happening there is amazing of many different levels. Your lecture was inspiring, in many levels, so I have 100 of questions for you, which I will not, because I also hope that the public will ask you something. I would limit the questions that I will ask to you to three main topics. Let's start to something that you said in many ways, but I would like to go back. The big questions that we are asking also ourselves is a museum a place of conservation, or is a museum a place of destruction? And that concerns, of course, everything. Objects are being detached from the original landscape, which happens, by the way, even in a small museum that you might have next to a site, because you take an object from the place where it is and you put in a showcase. So anyway, you intervene, but on the other side you show, talking about Angkor Wat, well, sometimes even a copy is something, a documentation of memory. So, but you said a lot of interesting things. You were pointing out in a kind of third way that maybe we still have to think together about ownership, titularity of objects, but cooperation is a word that you repeated again and again. It was amazing to see what you showed, what has been done together between Germany and Russia in terms of cooperation, so sometimes not insisting of having objects back, and how we can find a third way. And this is something that I'm thinking a lot about, also thinking of the future, because we can, all museum directors, spend the coming 30 years in tribunals, in court, fighting about ownership, but maybe we can find a third way. And, well, what is your idea concerning that?
Well, I think, first of all, if things have been stolen or taken illegally, there's no discussion, they have to be given back. But the point is that not everything is stolen and looted, as many people, certain activists try to make us think, or try to make the public think. This is not the case. And normally I didn't hear that in Africa, in Oceania. I was once in Vanuatu, and in the museum, the director, he showed me the museum, then we went to the depot, and he showed me, well, look, none of these objects is older than 30 years. And I expected now the question, yes, but all this is in Europe. And he said, thanks to you, it's still preserved. And then he explained me, we even didn't collect it. If something was in a bad condition, we threw it off and made a new one. So this thinking of collecting is not theirs. And of course now they are, of course, thankful, grateful that we collected 100 years, 150 years ago, because they can trace back the tradition of our certain artworks. So there are many examples, but I think the basic point is, of course, bringing an object to a museum, I would not say it is a distraction. This, in a way, yes, in another way, not. You're taking objects out of a context, but maybe it's also destroyed if it remains in the context. But I think what we have to do is to build up a new context, and this new context of course needs cooperation, and including other, especially in the ethnographic collections, other kinds of knowledges, indigenous knowledge. I'm an archaeologist, I didn't know that. The people I'm dealing with, they died millennia before, I can't ask nobody. So an Egyptian or an African archaeologist is working like we are working, with the same methodology. But I realized also, and I learned a lot, the ethnographers of today, they do not have this indigenous knowledge. Of course, some of them are working in certain countries with communities, but there are more linguistic studies and others, geographic studies, economic studies, social studies, but not the material turn in a way did not touch at least the university ethnography. So there's so many important facts and knowledges they can bring in. And this is also what makes them happy, that we tell the right stories. Because if you continue telling the wrong stories or an incomplete story, only the Westerner perspective, it's also a kind of distraction, if you want. And this, I think, this is this third way, which is very, very promising. And wherever we so all are doing, my colleagues, of course, the curators, wherever we go, if it's China or Laos or wherever, the people are full of energy to enter in this kind of co-production. It's not only cooperation, it's a kind of co-production. And a last element is including the communities which we have in the countries. Because in Berlin, there are not only Turkish people, there are also from Cameroon and so on, and now more and more, and they are not all activists. They are happy to find some cultural items, which they have some knowledges. They remind stories their parents, their grandparents told them, and also step by step including them. I think this is another important source to make a museum then also on the spot where it is inclusive for society.
Well, I think I completely agree with what you said, and also I agree with the fact, well, when something is stolen, well, we all read the book of Dan Hicks, there is like a red line. When something is an act of violence, has to go back, and for the rest we can find way of cooperation. And moreover, I think all the time we concentrate all the time still on objects, and of course it's important, the titularity of the objects, but how much circulation there is of people. I dream of a future where there is really hybridization, where an Egyptologist, well, there is an international community, and you say, well, an Italian or German or French or English Egyptologist can spend maybe some years in an Egyptian institution, and many Egyptians can come in our institution because we learn from each other. So, and also you can exchange objects because you want to work together and cooperate together and build new stories. You showed us how museum can be at the center, let's say, even of international politics. We have seen Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin together, but you also insisted on the fact of how a museum has to build within the community where it is, and within different cultures. We can say building up a memory, which can be a shared memory, can be different memories of different parts of community living together. We sometimes you read in the press that we are looked at or seen as institution of the past, like museum were looked at something that belongs to the past. Nevertheless, nothing is less true. In 1815, there were in Europe 35 museums. Now there are 18,000, and I read that never, like last year, museums have been so visited. So actually, we are still very active in our society, even though not anybody recognizes that. So, do you think we have a future? Do you think that this intellectual creation, if you want, of the Enlightenment, like Grande Galerie du Louvre opened in 1792, of course we know the British Museum 1653, we could also go a little bit back, let me say that since we are in Italy, that Ulisse Aldrovandi founded one of the first modern museums in Bologna, giving it to the city. Well, this model, which more or less have now 200, 250 years, do you think is still a vital model of creating memory within society? Does the museum have a future?
Yes, I'm 100% convinced. And I think and I'm really convinced they will have a wonderful future if they change. A museum cannot always stay as it has been. A museum of 19th century cannot be the same as in the 21st century. So we have, of course, for example, now, as this discussion about restitution, why are these things here, we learn that our visitors, and not even the German visitors, they want to know why these objects are here. We have to explain why this research has been done. This is also important, it's part of our institutional history. We have to tell this story also. So we have to observe the society. We have to teach society by delighting them, as Wilhelm von Humboldt said. Teaching works only if it's connected with delighting. But at the same time, we have to address also what is important for them. And how the society 100 years ago in Germany, or only 50 years in Germany, was completely different from today. And this was not the case in London, for example. They have a longer colonial history and so on. But in Germany it was more homogeneous. In Berlin in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Then it changed. we also have to include these parts of societies and not marginalize them. Our Museum of Islamic Art, and they are not coming by themselves. They are not coming, you offer on your website a tour through the museum in Turkish or Arabic. This is nonsense. They speak German, they do not need a translation. This is even insulting them in a way. But you have to go there and bring them, because by themselves they are normally not coming. So they have really an outreach program. They go into the clubs in Kreuzberg, in these famous parts of Berlin, making contacts with societies, associations of these people, and making cooperation and bringing them to the museums. And this is the way of doing it. And another nice story, which also the director of our Museum of Islamic Art created, when this huge wave of refugees came from Syria and Iraq in 2015 and the following years, he set up a training program for museum guides. And it was through internet. They have their social media channels. He is married to a Syrian, so he has access, you know how to activate these social media channels. On Thursday at 10 o'clock, who wants to get a training as a museum guide comes to the Bode Museum. And then on Thursday at 10 o'clock, there have been a crowd of 25, 30 refugees. And there are three elements, which at that time is very important. Please, not only the Museum of Islamic Art. Bring them to the Bode Museum, Christian art of medieval period, and bring them to the German Historical Museum. European history, 20th century, a history of destruction, complete destruction. And then they made a program with these three elements. And when I once met them and talked to a group of them, they said, well, they started with Islamic Museum. They said, why the hell are these objects here? The second reaction was, well, it's good that they're here, because if they would have continued being in Syria, they would have destroyed. And then after a certain period of training, they say, now we really understand why it's important that it is here, because in all this comparative view on world cultures, Islam has to have also a place. And now I can compare Islam to late antiquity or to Byzantine or whatever. And then they understood it. And then once also they told me they have been sitting in the Bode Museum, and then there was art of the 17th century, this war of 30 years, which Central Europe was completely devastated. Half of the population was killed between Protestants and Catholics. And of course, you could explain them, the historical background as, my God, this is like the Shia and Sunni. No? So you understand what's happening. You get a new perspective through other stories, also on your story. And this is so important. And I mean, even if these people, if they stay in Germany, they should have both perspectives. But even if they go back to Syria, they should have also the other perspective. And there are so many examples, but we have to accept that we cannot only present objects in the best possible way. We have to go beyond that. I know this is very easy to say, because museums are fighting with budgets, with human resources, and so on and so on. This is clear. But just in general, I think it is very important to address this kind of topics. Museum can contribute so much to society.
Yes, well, I do agree, and I do agree how museums are so important also in a multicultural society. There are many issues at stake here, and sometimes when you do cultural policy, is not always understood, and it can be misused by political issues that have nothing to do for what we want to do. But you are right that there are different memories, different pasts. I do regret myself that in 2019 we did not pass the definition of museums that was proposed in Kyoto, where it was very clear also the concept of memories and pasts and future that you can build in a museum. I have a last question for you. Those who criticize a museum, or those who doubt the fact that a museum can have a future, they say, well, in a word of digital transition, because we are not even in the revolution, we are already in an applying transition, is especially younger generation, they say they have a little span of concentration. They're used to use to have digital device. They can have all the photographs in their hands. Do the museum have a future? Whenever I'm asked this question, I always think that in 1838, François Arago, when he presented to the French Academy the fact that daguerreotypie was invented, so there was this new technological revolution, one of the major technological revolutions of 2 centuries ago, he linked it immediately to Egypt. So it was new technology, and he said, give l'Institut d'Egypte 1 or 2 of these machines, and they will document thousands of hieroglyphs in the monuments that mankind would not be able to document. Well, fortunately, it was partly right. 200 years later, we still need epigraphers, we still need archaeology, we still need people to document. A photograph is a means, but it's not the solutions. So, is digital going to destroy our relation to material culture, or is a chance for museum?
No, I think it's an enormous chance, even including artificial intelligence, well applied. Of course, it was discussed since many years, saying, well, if everything is digitized, to have tours through the museum on the computer, why you have to go there? I never was afraid about that, and because we have discs, we have CDs, and nevertheless people go to opera or to concert halls because it's different to stand in front of a huge monumental Egyptian statue or to see it just on a photo. I think this special aura of the original only can offer the museum. But of course, if you go to a city and you select as a tourist to which museum I go, you must have a good digital or virtual presentation. This is for the decision to which place I go. I think especially for younger people, but even for my generation, it's decisive. 1 point. So attracting people. It's a huge help attracting people. Secondly, this augmented reality, virtual reality, and many other methods of applying digital tools for education, for explaining, for opening new accesses, for an understanding the stories behind the object. We had now for several years, together with many other German museums, we got quite a good money for developing these methods, evaluating them, and then making them accessible, applicable by all public museums in Germany. It helps a lot. So there's many possibilities, and of course then we always are criticized and have to say, okay, the percentage of our collection which is digitized is still rather low. Of course, you have millions of objects, it's not easy, and people many times think it's just scanning and putting it online. No, you need the metadata, you need right descriptions, and it's not so easy. And this is something which the museums for the future, I mean everywhere, it's a challenging task which we have to fulfill. So we are still, maybe we did 20% if it's much, and the rest is still has to be done. But then even with artificial intelligence, this is a lot of help now with texts. We are working already. Methods, again, well applied to helping doing research on these collections, because all our museums, and yours as well, are not galleries, are not exhibition halls. We are, as we say, we are institutions of memory. So our forefathers, predecessors, they collected not 5 paintings from Picasso and then it's enough because I have already 5, or 3 statues from the Old Reich and this is enough. No, as much as possible, and of course to preserve it also. So in our depots, a lot of information still must be investigated, and this digital means also help us in developing new narratives. So I think in many different ways, it's an enormous help, always well applied.
I do agree, and I also think that to give, for instance, we are developing a policy in the museum to give free access to all our objects, 3D models, what we are doing. and we have a journal, a scientific journal, which is in HTML format, and everybody can use and download everywhere. And I also think that when we talk about decolonize, this is also a very true way of decolonizing, because you give access to the collection everywhere to everybody, even and I hope that in the near future we can also give access completely to our library, that people can have information no matter where they are. If they have an internet connection, they have the same access to books and library, and really we share the knowledge, which I think is very important. I would keep asking you questions, but I would like to, and we have also quite many young people, but well, everybody of course is entitled. So we have a few minutes. Would you like to ask a questions, curiosity, or whatever you think, having the great chance of having Professor Parzinger here with us? So who has questions? Yes.
We discuss museum, object, pictures and so on, but I want to understand how you imagine the visitor in the future.
The history in the future or historian?
No, the visitor.
The visitors in the future. I
think the type of the visitors or the...
Of course, difficult to say, but I think the visitor in the future will be more demanding. Not before. People entered a museum with a certain modesty and the holy halls, the holy galleries. I think this, in a way, is over. I mean, it's not too bad to pay respect to artistic expressions from other periods and from other parts of the world, but the visitor is not demanding this. They are demanding us. They are demanding us, and I think, therefore, this will not be as easy. We have to convince them, we have to tell the right stories. They will not immediately believe what we are saying, so we have to argue, and therefore these digital means are more and more important, because there is an object and you cannot write a novel on a tablet. No, so you have to use tablets, or you have to other devices. If you are interested and you have questions, to get more information with barcodes, what more and more museums are doing. So this will continue, I think. People will be more demanding.
Yes, and make our work more challenging all the time, of course, which is good, because we are questioned and challenged. Any other questions? Yes.
Good evening, thank you for your overview. So, having so many objects from different cultures and several places, have you ever had any co-design activities with common people, so potential visitors, in order to make it easy for them to understand what they could find in your museum? And if not, would you be interested in?
Acoustical, I didn't get it, because it's a kind of,
she asked,
it's a kind of echo in the hall.
Given the multicultural provenance of your collection, have you worked in co-designing and co-curating displays also with communities? And yes or no? And are you planning to do so, or even more in the future?
In the Humboldt Forum, a great part of the galleries is co-curated. In others, we curated it, because of course to move a museum of 20,000 square meters from one part of Berlin to another part of Berlin, it's for almost 10 years was an enormous challenge. And of course you have to have a plan, because otherwise you don't finish. But in the last years we cooperated more and more with the countries of origin and with so-called source communities. And then part of the galleries are co-curated. We are working on these galleries to change them in the future. This is also another issue for the museums. These museums which have a gallery is presented and then it's as it has finished forever, or for the next 30, 40 years, is difficult. Of course, it's another question, because it needs also, you need the means to change it. So what we thought from the beginning is not to make it too, from the designers, in a way that when you once want to tell a new story and change the narrative, that you need a completely new design, new vitrines. This is not possible. So you have to take into account a certain mobility within. So we want to develop these narratives further on. And then there are other galleries which have been only curated by our curators, but in the last part of the opening, in September of 2022, we invited colleagues from all over the world, about 100 curators and community representatives from all over the world. And it was very funny. Even in the galleries where they did not co-curate with us, they stood there because there was an opening week for several days. People went in, politicians, journalists, normal people, the public, and they stood there and explained. So they have not been unhappy. They said, well, some things that perhaps I would have been differently, but more or less they have been happy what our curators did. But even there, we want for the future to cooperate in a more intensive way. So I think this is a very important task for the future, especially for ethnographic museums. Less for archaeological ones. Of course, we also have cooperations, but for me as an archaeologist, again, it's you can talk to the people who know much more about the objects, which you cannot excavate or find in a written source or whatever. This is a new kind of source, and you have to include it.
Thank you.
Some other questions? Well, if not, I thank you again for coming and for giving us this amazing view of the transformation. I have one small slight question now. You showed also all the plan and also the architectonical transformation. So you said the completion of the Pergamon Museum will be 2037. How do you deal with having, I think with pain in your heart, to having to close a museum for so many years, a museum that has such masterpieces of word architecture? How do you deal with that, and how do you think of the public that now is not possible, cannot go there, and how do you relate with them and share information? And
this is really a huge problem, as you can imagine. But nevertheless, the Pergamon Museum will not close now and will be closed until 37. A part is already closed since 10 years, more than half of it. Nevertheless, in this third, the southern wing, which we have opened, we have 800,000 visitors a year. So it's still, people like it. People love this presentation of architecture. This is so clear, because you really are not looking into vitrines, you are standing in the vitrine. And this
it's one of my favorite places when I'm in Berlin, because you feel so small next to the Ischer door or the Ephesus building. Is incredible even now.
But the whole building will only be closed a little bit more than 3 years. Then the part which is now closed for 10 years will open. And this is the Pergamon altar, which is number 1, and the northern wing with the Islamic part, the Islamic galleries. So it's 3.5 years, which will be very difficult because we need the income. The entrance fees is our income, and of course there's 5 million a year, which we are losing, and this will be 3.5 difficult years.
Everybody will go to the Neues and then compensate in that way.
Then when it's open, of course. Then.
Well, thank you so much. We also have understood that we need to go back to Berlin. Thank you so much.